as well. So, on behalf of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IISER Bhopal, a very warm welcome to all of you to this talk this afternoon, our sixth talk in this IISER-B Humanities webinar series that we started a few months ago during this very bleak pandemic year. And today it is our great pleasure to have Professor Rita Kothari among us to talk to us, and a very warm welcome to Professor Kothari, and thank you so much for being here to talk to us and our students, as well as people from outside IISER Bhopal who have joined. So for people who are familiar with Professor Kothari's work, of course, she needs no introduction. Professor from Ashoka University, and a translator and literary scholar and cultural scholar, is a very well acclaimed, noted for her work about the Sindhi community in the western part of India. And it is very pertinent here that we are in Bhopal here, which has a very significant Sindhi population. So we are hoping that some people from Bhopal outside of the institute have also joined us. So I think I will hand over to Anuparna, and I'd also like to thank Anuparna for getting Professor Kothari facilitating this talk, and for getting her to agree to talk to us. And I'll hand over to Anuparna, who will give a formal introduction of the speaker. So I will kind of hand over now to Anuparna, and thank Professor Kothari once more for being here. And her talk today is entitled "Broken Words Being Sindhi in India." So we greatly look forward to the talk and to a lively discussion afterwards. So before I hand over to Anuparna and then to Professor Kothari, just a couple of announcements. Kindly keep your microphones and your cameras switched off other than the speaker during the talk. And also at the end of the talk, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box. We'll take them from the chat box, and we'll moderate the question and answer and discussion session at the end. So with that, I will hand over to Anuparna. And Anuparna, over to you.
Thank you, Antara, to set, as usual, you have set the ball rolling. So thank you, Rita, once again. It's our absolute delight to have you here. And I'm very happy that, we had been planning this for quite some time. But the course that I'm offering this semester gave me an opportunity to kind of extend this into, something more substantial. So thanks, Rita, for, agreeing to kind of, deliver this talk. So what we're going to do before, we get into the formal introduction, just to kind of give you an update, a heads up about the structure of this, this talk that we have arranged. So I'm going to briefly kind of contextualize the talk in the light of the course that I have offered, and then I'll sort of leave the stage to Rita for 30-35 minutes. She can talk. After that, we'll open the house to, for a, formal and informal conversation, and then wind up. Then Rita can take everything together. We can take everything together and have the, the concluding words. So let's begin with an introduction. There's a long, list of achievements in her very distinguished career, but we have just, picked up a few things here. Dr. Rita Kothari is Professor of English and the Director of the Masters in English program at Ashoka University. She earned her MPhil and a PhD in Literary Studies and Translation from Gujarat University, Ahmedabad. She has previously taught at St. Xavier's College, Ahmedabad, MICA, Ahmedabad, and Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar. She is a multilingual scholar and translator whose work spans across different disciplines such as literature, cultural studies, anthropology, sociology, and history. Her questions emerge from observations of region and communities in the western part of the Indian subcontinent, Gujarat, Kutch, and Sindh. Her ethnographic research in marginal communities through religion, caste, occupation, and gender focuses upon narratives of identity, raising questions of both linguistic and cultural migration and translation. Professor Kothari has translated extensively from Gujarati and Sindhi into English, and occasionally vice versa. Her translations, as well as her edited volumes, have made significant contributions to the field of language politics and translation. Her books include Memories and Movements, Border and Communities in Banni, Kutch, Gujarat, which was published by Orient Black Swan, The Burden of Refuge, The Sindhi Hindus of Gujarat by Orient Black Swan again in 2019, and then Translating India, The Cultural Politics of English, published by Routledge in 2005, and then it was republished by Cambridge University Press in 2008. And of course, the text, the book that we teach in our syllabus is Unbordered Memories, which was published in 2009 by Penguin. So just to create a context for this course, so this semester, we're offering a course on memory, movement, and migration. Of course, earlier Antara offered courses on partition, memory, previous to, I think that's before I joined this institute. So we have a tradition of, looking at the South Asian, the narratives through the lens of memory, movement, migration, etc., etc. Now, in this course, we not only look at partition, in isolation, we look at other forms of human movements as well. But partition certainly occupies the center stage. And the focus of this course was not to look at partition as a grand narrative, but to focus on, the regional narratives. To talk a little bit about Assam, talk about the regional narrators within Bengal, and then, of course, talk about Punjab and Sindh. And this is something that I kind of owe greatly to, Rita in that sense, because it was through Rita's translation, in fact, of the Unbordered Memories that I became conscious, as was 10, 11 years back, that of these little, the micro narratives of the region and how they kind of stand out. It's not only about the continuity, but, particularly when we talk about the Sindhi narrative, there are a few things that kind of completely stands out. For instance, when we read about Bengal and partition, perhaps because of the carnage, because of the overwhelming violence that happened, there's a prolonged strain of mourning that kind of overwhelms everything, particularly with Bengali partition, the Bengal chapter of the partition. Whereas in Sindh, you look at the Sindh chapter, there is almost, of course, mourning is there. Mourning is part of any kind of narrative of loss, but there is a kind of, pragmatism, there is a kind of nimbleness and the eagerness to rebuild the lives and a tremendous sense of pride, which is kind of, something that, of course, the Punjabi stories talk about pride, Bengali, but it's a very different, strain of affect that we see there. In Sindh, pride almost takes a center stage, and this urge to kind of begin almost at once. And that is sometimes, almost appears, it almost appears that, there is a kind of, how do I put it? It's way too pragmatic, perhaps, when you can lay them aside or kind of place them side by side with, the narratives of other partition, let's say. So, today we're going to talk about the regional specificities, and I would request Rita to kind of give us, of course, while reading these stories, while reading the stories of, Sindhi partition, we had Buri, for instance, as a part of our, syllabus. But I would kind of once again ask Rita to kind of create a context for Sindhi partition, because this is something that we do not discuss very frequently, and how Sindh was kind of standing out in many ways. For instance, we talk a lot about, when we talk about Punjab partition, we talk a lot about the carnage, communal carnage. But when we read these stories of Sindhi partition, we do not really have a lot of instances where, physical violence is mentioned. Once or twice, I mean, we do come across such instances, but even there, it's much more about the outsiders coming in and kind of destroying the harmony of the city, rather than the insiders kind of fighting, with each other. So I would be very happy that if you could kind of, give us a context for the Sindhi partition, and then, kind of take us through a journey
Mm.
of how they resettled in India and how they began their, life.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
thank you so much, Antara and Anuparna. And that was a fairly engaged, fairly informed, and a fairly extensive introduction and prelude. Uh, the questions that lie before me, Anuparna, as I listen to you, and I'm guessing that the students here who have taken your course are, if I understand correctly, largely BTech students.
No, we have MA and PhD students,
Oh,
so they
you
are
do?
doing it.
Okay. So
Yes,
it's a
yes.
mix, but there would be BTech as well, right?
BTech, but
Mm.
yes, but
Yeah.
primarily this course was meant for advanced students, so at
I see.
master's level
Right.
and PhD level.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the reason I ask this is because when I was teaching partition in IIT Gandhinagar, I remember an engineering student who became fairly close to me, and he said, "Ma'am, abhi yaar chodo bhi, jo ho gaya so ho gaya." You know, कितने साल तक ये सब आप सोचते रहोगे? And this question as to when will you make peace with the past? When will we make peace with partition? I think is a pretty relevant question, right? And while I ask myself as to how does that past actually shape our present, and I think it shapes in very, very profound ways. Uh, it's also important to ask myself because I am a Sindhi after all. And the question of how long do you want to cling to a certain idea of the past is a question that even I ask myself quite often. But so there's a part of me which actually resists the logic of my own community. And there's a part of me which also thinks about it because I am of the community, right? And so I think for me, the challenge as of today is, Anuparna, not only about the questions I've asked, the work I did, but also to see how do I see that 10 years later. The Unbordered Memories was 2009, as you said. And really speaking, 11 years later, now when I look back upon the book, and I can see that there is a very distinct sort of a voice to it, which you very rightly picked up as one that is absent in physical violence. But what is interesting is that now when I look back, there are also stories there which I actually read differently. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about that because I think your students, since they're already studying that text, they might be able to relate to it much better. So if you remember, there is this one story, right, about a hari, right, a cultivator in Sindh. And there are people who come from Punjab and so on, or usi gaon mein log aate hain. Is that okay if I sometimes switch over to a bit of Hindi?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there are people who come to that village and they talk to each other and they say to each other that maybe we should learn Sindhi, maybe we should learn Punjabi, and they exchange animals with each other. The story is called Oxen, right? And you've got this one Hari from Sindh who's got the oxen of this another Muhajir Hari, and he gives instructions to the oxen in Sindh, and he says "Sade paase, khabe paase," something, and the oxen doesn't understand, and he keeps whiplashing on the body of the beasts, and he feels that maybe he's been given the wrong beasts, and then they exchange the beasts back with each other, and he realizes that in both cases the animals had been lacerated violently because the animals couldn't understand the language of the cultivators. And then he asks himself that अल्लाह ॼाणे हिननि सां थियो आहे त माण्हुनि सां छा थींदो हूंदो, मतलब लोगों के साथ क्या होता होगा, what happens to human beings if this is what happens to animals, right? And this is a story that, I mean, it's a pretty sort of a poignant, fairly heartbreaking story, and largely because language is a very, very important site to understand the Sindhi experience of partition. And I think it is in the Sindhi experience of partition that we also understand what the loss of territory and region does to language, and what the loss of language does to our sense of history, to our sense of past, to our sense of present, and what are these forms of brokenness that emerge thereby. But one of the ways by which I have gone back to the story is also kind of to ask myself that what kind of made me think that, or what made the cultivators think that the animals were speaking Sindhi? And to what extent is this a certain Anthropocene way of looking at the story? Is it that in our absorption of the human side of migration, we actually don't also look at other forms of migration, right? The migration of many other bodies that happens, also the fact that some things don't migrate at all. And it's interesting, many years later, when I was working on memories and movements, and this is a book that is based on the Indo-Pak villages near the region of Banni in Kutch, in around the northern Kutch in Gujarat. And the last village, Dhordo, is absolutely contiguous along the run of Kutch. And really speaking, if you were to actually go by a camel as people used to, or go by a horse or a donkey, it's possible that you would reach Sindh faster than you would reach the city of Bhuj in Kutch itself, right? That is the kind of route it had. And the cattle from Banni would have green pastures, sometimes in what became Sindh and sometimes in what became Kutch. But that's not a story that I ever managed to tell. It's because I think we get focused actually on the owners of these animals. And now when I'm thinking that how we need to understand forms of partition and migration in their entire ecologies, in the words, in the stories, in the songs, in the objects, in the human and the non-human. And really speaking, when we look at it that way, we also realize that one is that we might be led to ask questions of what things actually do move and which things don't move. And one of the things I feel like, which is the hardest to move, which is the hardest to transport, which is the hardest to translate in some sense, is actually experience. It is the non-portability of experience that I'm completely struck by. And I feel that even though we may have linguistically translated something, there is a certain something that never actually found its way to language. In which case, how was I to take that from one language to another, considering that it did not even find its way into words, from experiences, from thoughts, and from what people went through. So to give you an example, I mean, the Sindhi Hindus whom I interviewed for The Burden of Refuge, for instance, would refer to that particular moment not as Batwara or as partition. Some people may say Ladpalan, and then the more literary ones would say Virango. And Virango is a more kind of a studied word. But very often people would say, oh, jadi Hindustan Pakistan thiyo, which means jab Hindustan hyphen Pakistan hua, but it can also mean jab Hindustan Pakistan ban gaya, right? And I find that ambivalence quite interesting. The ambivalence of recognizing that a bifurcation happened, but also an ambivalence of illegitimacy this gives to the idea of Pakistan, which is to say that it was originally Hindustan. And really speaking, I'm now thinking that our legitimacy of one experience sometimes is by default making some other experience illegitimate, right? That our affect about partition delegitimizes the idea of Pakistan. And these are some of my more current questions. I'm not saying I'm working on them. I think they are more subliminal. They may inform many other things that I do. So I just wanted to put it out there so that your students also know that that questions evolve, that translation is an ongoing process, that it is not a one-time thing, that you translate and you seal it and the book is published and then you're done with it. For instance, I was telling my students yesterday about another story in Unbordered Memories, which again you would remember. It's a story called Boycott. And it's a story of this man who's a Koli, right? His name is Jaman, I think, and Jaman Koli. And he's being told by the Vadero in the village and someone who used to be Abdul Razak, who used to be very active in the National Muslim Guard. And he says, "Yaman to kai kam karno ha Pakistan jila, you have to do this for Pakistan, that the Hindus have to leave. And there are still some Hindus who haven't gone to Hindustan, and we need to make sure that they leave, and you have to take their business over." And Jaman is a Dalit, and that's another thing that I want to talk about, which is, I mean, I think Urvashi Bhutalia in Other Side of Silence does have a chapter on Dalits, and later you do find Shekhar Bandyopadhyay and many others who have begun to work on, I mean, even for instance, Manoranjan Vyapari's interrogating My Chandal Life is actually in some sense both it's a Dalit autobiography, but it is also a partition memoir of the Namashudra community in Bengal. So, but in Sindh, what happens is that you read something like this, and you read that this is a Koli, and then later in Gujarat, I did some work with the community of Kolis, but the connection with the story actually sort of has hit me only very recently. And what that did to me is also to kind of realize that Jaman Kohli, for instance, in that story, who's been told to kind of start a shop, become a halwai suddenly, and sell sweets so that the Hindu Vanya of the village, they don't get customers, but now the customers come to Muslims. I mean, some of these things are sometimes a part of occupations that you've done for generations. And Jaman Kohli sells Islamic pakoda and Islamic mithai, but nobody comes to take anything from him. Or he's not able to give anything on credit, which the Vanyas were able to, because they did have more money with them. And then later, Jaman Kohli is being kind of thrown out. He has lost whatever little money he had. And towards the end, he says that, "I have now understood that Pakistan was made for powerful people like you. People like me are the ones who will always be boycotted." And this English word boycott, whose meaning Jaman did not know, by the end of the story, he has understood that he is actually the subject of that boycotting, and he will always be. So while the regional variations of the Pakistan account, from Punjab to Bengal to Sylhet to Assam to Ladakh, all these differ from each other. There are certain questions which may be common, but their intensities differ. Maybe some of their answers differ. Sometimes the context may be similar, but not quite the same. But I think one thing we do realize that the very poor, the very vulnerable, are also the least fortified by history. That the rich and the elite are somewhat fortified even during partition. To me, this was one of the biggest learnings that I had from my work on Sindh partition. So for instance, the Amils who lived in Karachi and so on, who had very highly paid bureaucratic jobs and were fairly kind of upper class and so on, and upper caste, because people like Kohli, Jaman Kohli and all are also Dalits who live in the southern part of Sindh, in the regions around Tharpakar and so on. And there is a very large population there who have continued to stay there more or less. So there are people from Karachi and so on who take flights out and come directly to places like Delhi and so on and find jobs here. There were money lenders of the Shikarpuri community that I come from, and some of them were already in places like Bangalore and Chennai and carrying on with their money lending business. Like the assault of coronavirus, the elites always have more opportunities to protect themselves. And whether that has to do with the pandemic today or it has to do with partition, the elites will find better forms of going from a place to place. They will find better ways to actually protect themselves. Their compensations come quicker. And so even within the so-called Sindhi experience of partition, I think I wanted to underscore this so that we are able to see that there is an unevenness in the subjects of history. There is also unevenness of memory, and which is to say that we may all be victims of history, but we may not actually our mode of knowing that, of remembering that, may not be historical. It may actually be, it may have a lot to do with a certain kind of an affect that is generated by memory. So, I mean, I've talked about this before, but I'll sort of mention it again because this is a figure that's quite important to me in many ways. My mother had this bua who we used to call Bhena, and Bhena is like Badi Behan. And my mother would call her Bhena, but Bhena was also my mother's Jethani, right? They were both married into the same family. And Bhena had something like 10, 11 children. And she lived her life just thinking about going from one child to another or whatever. And at the time of partition, she must have been maybe 10, 12 years old. And I remember taking her to a homeopath, and he was asking her, as homeopaths do sometimes, a lot of history of, how do you negotiate with anger? Do you sleep well? Do you do this? Do you do that? And it was very new for her. And he's asking her, he said, और आपको गुस्सा आता है? She said, हाँ, गुस्सा करके क्या करेंगे? भगवान ने सब अच्छा दिया है, and so on. She talked, one thing about the Sindhis is you cannot understand the Sindhi community without understanding a certain kind of a spiritual tradition that informs the community. Spirituality, business, and Hindi films, I think, are the three very important ingredients to understand this community. And so he's asking Bhena that, acha, aap kahan se ho? And he says, janam to hamara wo Hindustan, Pakistan hua na, usse pehle hua tha. And so this is a Gujarati homeopath. He doesn't, so he says, so matlab, कब कहाँ आप partition के time 47 में आए थे? She said, वो तो पता नहीं कब था. So there is you have experienced a history, but you don't know the historical details of what you've experienced, right? And there are also forms of unevenness which have to do with gender. So, for instance, you'll find in some discussion of this in The Burden of Refuge that women remember a different set of things than the men. And also, they will often talk about all of it in the passive construction. They will say, हाँ असी होया सी असी बैठा सी असा के चाव बयाने हलो, हमको कहा गया कि चलो यहाँ से, तो हमने, because they were not the ones taking the decision. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that it's not as if, I mean, that I'm a second generation partition family, but even for me, the so-called truth of the Sindh partition is actually mediated so much by the family I came from, by also the kind of social, demographic, caste, class, location that they had. The story, the Bhuri that you mentioned, who sells papads, and then she's become what we consider from Sharanarthi to a Purusharthi. And it is true that that's a very big trope in the Sindhi community. For instance, you will find the men say, Besa gana nahi asa sarkar jo khaunga, line mein bhi kare. Like, how long could we have bloody stood in the line, taking doles from the government? I mean, the Sindhis are very impatient about taking doles. By and large, वो नौकरियां इतनी नहीं करते. And therefore, this idea that we need to be more kind of Atmanirbhar is a very big thing among the Sindhi community. And so the pride, of course, comes from there. But as I've said, there is also, and maybe this is something that I'll return to later, when I was listening to you use the word pride, and a lot of people who write about Sindhis, they talk about this pride. But I think if I had to think of my big intervention or my small intervention, as the case may be, in that ecumene, it is the fact that I talk about shame. I don't talk about pride. I talk about the sense of shame in Sindhi identity. And it's possible that after having written Burden of Refuge some 14 years ago, I think I may have now an opportunity to think about that somewhat differently. It's possible that that's not the case anymore. And I would love to hear from some of the students in this class today who may be Sindhi and who are from Bhopal, as you mentioned. But at a time when I was actually writing the book, there was a sense of, I mean, there would be students coming to my college and not mention Sindhi as their mother tongue in the form. There are people I've quoted in the book who say, no, I don't speak the language and I don't want people to know that I'm a Sindhi. And so that this unease of the Sindhi identity, which I kind of contextualize in the context of Western India, and I talk about how a certain amount of non-textualized Hinduism, a perception that these are people from Pakistan, that they are dirty, they are aggressive, that they are non-vegetarians, all of that goes on to a generation of very negative stereotyping and an internalization of that hegemony in that region. And while I haven't actually, I think I've been vindicated in this, especially where in the location that I talk about, but I also see new sort of narratives which are actually quite interesting. And I'm only watching it right now, but for instance, I do see a lot of people on Instagram and stuff, young people who'll put up recipes and who'll talk about, I heard this from my dadi, and I heard that from my dadi, and where ajrak, and so on. And when I think through all of this, Anuparna, there is a sense that comes to me, which is that what actually constitutes the Sindhi identity. And I think in whichever form it is probably true that all identities are forms of pastiche. They are put together through certain means and certain ingredients. But it also seems to me that there is a brokenness that characterizes the Sindhi community. And what is that brokenness? The brokenness is this, that what we consider as the place of origins is eclipsed by a hyper nationalist politics and remains very inaccessible to us. Not to mention that that region itself uh, is besieged by a more dominant idea of Pakistan. Secondly, the brokenness is the fact that the Perso-Arabic script in which the language was written has become sort of pretty much out of use for generations now. There are very few exceptions. And I see one person here in the audience who I know is quite exceptional in that sense. There is also this, that while the community struggled to say, Sindhi bolo, sharm na karo, and I don't have to explain the resonances of saying this. And they felt that should we use the Devanagari script or the Perso-Arabic script? And at some point, the community, I mean, after fighting with each other over questions of script, then finally said, whatever, as long as you speak. But we know now that the language is disappearing, at least from India, at a very, very fast rate. So there is that brokenness. And the brokenness is also about this very divided sort of an epistemic moment that I'm mentioning of being both proud and shameful, somewhat embarrassed and somewhat boastful. And the relationship with its tradition, with its history, with that heritage, if you like, is manifest in another kind of brokenness, which is broken images, broken words. And so, for instance, people will say, oh, I make Sindhi curry. I mean, who says Sindhi curry? Sindhis themselves don't say it, for heaven's sake. Or they'll say, sell bhaji, or, whatever. And items, names of food, of clothing, few words here and there. Is that what we've got? Is that what we should live with? And is that the future of this really, really interesting, amazing community? I think it's a story to feel proud of, but there is also much to feel sad about. And I want to end there for the moment.
Thank you, Rita. Fantastic and very incisive as usual. So we will, of course, take the questions and the questions from the house. Please feel free to type your questions. We'll take them one by one. And while you're putting your thoughts together, so let us kind of quickly, go through the journey very briefly and take few of the points that Rita kind of iterated, or sort of, brought up. Very, very important, I think. Again, the idea of disproportionate suffering, as we have seen it, with COVID-19, and so correctly pointed out, because COVID-19 also became a portal through which we could see the, past in certain sense, and the, discussion, in fact, very interestingly, this time, when we spoke about partition or any of these movements, COVID-19 was all there, and and rightly so. So again, that idea of disproportionate suffering, who suffered, even as you pointed out, when we were talking about the Sindhi stories, some of the business communities had a better deal. Whereas, because they had their own networks in India already, from which, from who could kind of supply them with food, succor, and help them to set up business again. Whereas some people, they had to go through a lot. So that's a very interesting idea. Then there's, of course, this entire ecology, or the affective ecologies that you brought in, into the discussion, that we often talk about the, human suffering, but what about the non-human agents? That is a very, very significant, again, a thread that we could actually take up. And the other thread that we, of course, we sort of, that you pointed out, is this idea of shame. And again, shame is very central to the, the stories of partition as we understand. But then again, there are so many nuances to that affect, or that whatever, emotion, as again, it would be mixed emotion, yeah, as well, because different people react to shame, or different people sort of, negotiate with, say, shame differently. For instance, when we read Sindhi story, one of the many things that I felt that, there is also a reticence about partition generally in many of the Sindhi narratives. They don't talk about, the community doesn't talk about partition all the time. Now, that silence could be partially, but again, shame and pride could be, tied to each other because of, a certain kind of self-respecting community, very, very industrious, who are always and very, very resilient. For them, as you pointed out, taking dole, or the negative stereotype that is attached to the refugees, I mean, talking about that in itself brings a certain kind of shame. Whereas in many of the narratives in Bengal, again, we have seen that, shame is interpreted entirely in a different vein. For instance, for them, because of the negative stereotypes which are attached to, this idea of the refugee, many people felt that they should stick to their identity of the refugee. They felt that we should not sort of forget that we were refugee once, and we would kind of stick to this identity, because, this years of shaming kind of, made us more determined to kind of, stick to our whatever, idea of, and that kind of connects us to the history of the struggle. So even different people, different communities react to different affects as well. So this is so many threads. So I would kind of request the house to kind of, put forth their questions. And I'm sure Rita would be very happy to take them. So do we have a question? I mean, I'm sure we have many. Okay. So Bhavna, you can unmute yourself. So, and just kind of, yeah.
But thank you. Ma'am, thank you so much for bringing up this talk. And being a Sindhi, I'm very delighted to be a part of it and to hear more about my own community. I did a study. I'm a PhD student at IIT Gandhinagar, and as my independent project, I did a study on Sindhi as a speech community in Ahmedabad. And I did realize what I really found from the study was the decline in speaking of Sindhi as a language and also the identity. However, I could see that there is a vast divide between class and caste. People still don't understand the difference between the caste and the class. So this is something I really wanted to know. Being called as a Shikarpuri or being called as a Larkana, or from let's say from maybe a Hyderabadi, who basically are known as dealing with gems in marriage. I mean, diamonds traders and all that. How do we actually understand caste in this context? And another thing I really wanted to put it out loud is that even the government itself is does not want, probably, and it wants that the identity of Sindhi as a stateless community should always be there, because with the decline in Sindhi schools in Ahmedabad, and also with I mean, the universities shutting down the centers which have Sindhi or which teach Sindhi at the BA and at the university level, we can see, how, I mean, what is the state of Sindhi community and Sindhi as a language in India in the present fastest government scenario. Thank you. So if you can shed some light on the caste aspect and the class aspect.
Sure, Bhavna. Very happy to know about the work you're doing. Do you want to switch on your video? Is there a reason why you don't want to?
I'm sitting. Yeah, it's okay. I'm here.
Yeah, I don't want to be talking to a box.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah, the caste question in the Sindhis is a very complicated one. It's complicated because, you see, at one level, as a Hindus, though they might be, the Sindhi Hindus are pretty unusual, right? In the sense that they've also worshipped historically many non-Brahminic gods. Right?
Yes.
So the severe differences of Shaivism and Vaishnavism, which is one of the big dividing lines, right, among some of the more kind of a mainland Indian Hindus, that the Sindhis have not been very particular about that. You would also know that the Sindhi temples will have Guru Granth Sahib, and then it will have a picture of Jhulelal, and then it will have Ram, and it will have Krishna.
Yeah.
And then they don't.
Yeah. The Sindhi Dham in Gandhinagar.
Right. So now the thing is, for people like me who worked earlier, and I was a much younger person and somewhat naive too, that we looked at this as a syncretic story. But in the process, I think we may not have actually quite understood the caste dimension of the community. And so to say I'm a Shikarpuri, asa ladka ne jaayun, asa Hyderabad jaayun, acha. That's not caste. You would know that these are places, right?
These are the localities.
These are localities. Now, when you look at, for instance, shadi.com or matrimony.com or whatever, and you check out Sindhi websites for boys and girls or whatever, and you will find that sometimes people would put down Shikarpuri and Ladkano as caste, right? But then sometimes they'll also say caste, or sometimes they'll say caste does not matter, but then they'll put down Shikarpuri because they don't quite know what to do. So in some sense, the self-identification through a particular caste was not very common to the Sindhi community, right? Historically. To say, asi the Brahman ayu, asi the Vani ayu, asi the hi ayu, wo ghat thindo yo. People, the reason being that one is this, that spatially, and this is where it becomes actually quite interesting and complex to understand, that spatially you have a very large scale Luhana community, the Banyas, right, which are Amils and Bhaibans. All these in the northern and central Sindh, and especially in the bigger cities, are doing business, and they are more or less homogeneous, as all of them being upper caste, so to speak. Either right, you would have some Pushkarna and some Saraswat Brahmins from Punjab, but a small number, not very significant, either sacerdotally, which means in terms of ritualistic place, or economically, or politically, or culturally, right? So what you had was what appeared like a very all-embracing business community.
Yes.
Now, it is possible for us to get lost in that story. In a way, I think I'm also a part of it. But I think it is also important for us to see then what was not shown to us, what remained invisible from us. And which is that if at the time of partition, the last census that was taken before partition in 1931 already shows you, I forget, about 20 to 30% Sindhis who are living in Tharparkar.
Tharparkar.
Yeah. And these are Meghwals, and then they are Kolis, and then there are Vadhas, and they are, right? All
Yeah.
kinds of, and these are Dalits. They are Sindhi speaking, right? So they are Sindhi Dalits, yes, of which some of them are artisan communities. Then you would also have sweepers and cobblers and all of that. So really speaking, because Pakistan did not have the kind of affirmative action policy that India had and such clear stratification of the SC, ST, and what have you, that might be partly the reason why we did not know. But it is also Pakistan's own invisibilization of the Dalit community. And it is also our own invisibilization of those communities because we were absorbed in our own story.
Right.
And therefore, when we say Sindhis, we only think of people like us.
Yeah, we don't think of, we
Yeah.
only think of Sindhi Hindus. There are also Sindhi Muslims as well.
That's I will come to that separately, Bhavna. At the moment, I'm only talking about this dimension of caste that you mentioned. Now, really speaking, there is, of course, a collapsing of caste and Muslimness also. But even when it is not, for instance, you will have in Tharparkar, you will have Dalit Hindus, and you will also have Pasmanda Musalman, and they're all speaking Sindhi. You get it? Now, the idea that there are the Sindhi Muslims whom we don't talk about at all is actually another scandal altogether. And it's nothing short of a scandal. You understand? And therefore, that particular issue I've written quite extensively about. So you might want to read Memories and Movements also.
Yeah.
Because that, and then you might want to read Sindhi Sikhs in India, right? A paper called The Missing People, Sindhi Sikhs in India. So it is true that, the Sindhi project should not turn into a project of Hindus.
Yeah.
You get it? And therefore, I think increasingly I am not actually invested in the idea of Sindh as a geographical terrain to which historically my parents have had a relation, my ancestors are from it. I think of increasingly Sindhi as a certain cartography of which I might find little oases every now and then. So it exists for me in Bardmer and Jaisalmer. It exists for me in Kutch. It exists for me, for instance, in Bhopal, where you guys, some people are. But it might also exist for me in parts of California and DC, where there are many Sindhis who live there. Now, these could be Sindhis who are by religion Muslims or Hindus or Sikhs or whatever, but which is why I am actually owning up to the idea of language as a very, very important way of thinking about this relationship. Does that answer your question, or is there something more specific?
No, it does, because I know it's a very complicated, topic, as well as, it is very interesting as well. So it's good that, my doubt was regarding caste, because if I look at it from when we say Sindhi, Sindhi is basically means a businessman, which means a Vaniya. So from the Hindu caste system, people will consider it Sindhi hai, matlab ki, Dunya hai. But that is not how the Sindhis internalize it like that. For them, they don't have anything like banya and all. For them, it's like asa dhande wara aayu, asanjo dhando hi ahe. So, yeah. So, I'm sorry, I might talk to you in Sindhi. I'm controlling myself.
No,
So,
you shouldn't. You should. I think that's another peculiar feature of Sindhi people. They don't talk in Sindhi at all.
I actually learned the Sindhi script as well. I did a certificate course and an advanced certificate course from MSU. So, and I also got a gold medal for that because I chose to write in Arabic in the Purzu script.
Good for you.
So I mean, it was out of my choice. I'm the only person who can who has done that and who can
Good
read
for
and
you.
write in Hindi
Yeah,
Arabic.
yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
ma'am, that was that was it. Also, there's a person, Maya David Khemlani. She is
Of
doing an
course.
extensive research on Sindhi in Malaysia.
Yeah,
And I mean, she also continuously keeps writing and does a research
yeah. I'm
on the
aware
Sindhi
of it. I'm
community.
aware of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, ma'am, that's it. I mean, if I have something else, then I'll definitely come up later about it then.
Or
Thank
you
you
can
so much.
send me an email. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Yes, definitely.
Thank you, Bhavna. Lovely to see you after a long time as well. So
Yes, thank you.
thanks, Bhavna, for your question. So we'll come to this question of language cartography and the interrelation and migration. But before that, we have a question from Vidya. Vidya, do you want to kind of unmute yourself and ask the question to Rita directly instead of me reading out your question? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, ma'am.
Hi.
My question was that when we say Sindhis, the image that we have that baniyas or dhande wara aayo ya sab business hi karna aayo. So what's happening is it probably the cultural side. Now that you read the short stories and the novels and all of that, you realize that there's a beautiful cultural side of Sindhiness, which is being faded away, like it is fading away. I want you to talk more about it if you could.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it got traded away very soon, Vidya. It's not being traded away now. I think it got traded away really soon. So, I mean, you would know this better than me, Vidya, because you have stayed in different parts and we've talked about this. So, in some sense, you got to these questions much early on. That, you know, when people like Master Chandar and all used to go to Sindhi Campun mein vani kare Gana Gainda, yeah, Anila Sundar who used to sing, or people who would go and Bhagat, right? Bhagat thinda hoya, Bhagat kanda hoya. It's actually the thing about Sindhis is that that it is entirely urban, right? The post-partition Sindhis in India are entirely urban. I'm not talking about the Mutwa and the Halepota and the communities that I've talked about in in Memories and Movements. And then within the urban cities, you know that Sindhis who lived in enclaves in the former refugee camps and Sindhis who lived in other parts, there is a huge difference, right? I mean, that's when Bhavna was asking question about class. This is one of the big things about Campuja and Campuja Konan Yacha. At least at a certain point, this was very important. I'm making qualification on all the generalizations that I may have made before because I also feel I need to reckon with changing times and I can't sort of keep saying the same thing. But so some cultural traditions, like in places like Ulasnagar and so on, I'm sure they existed for a much longer time. And we have no reason to believe that they weren't happening there. But by and large, you're right. I mean, they did disappear. And I think region has a lot to do with it. The ruptures of history have a lot to do with it. So it was very actually surprised. I almost wept when I went to Karachi and all, and when people were talking about the institutions that Sindhi Hindus had established, Utanju College, hospital, libraries. I wept the most actually when people told me that library the Tajiran Manu Nite Shuru Kayu. And I'm thinking, is this the same community? You know, they don't read books. मतलब कुछ घर पे किताब ही नहीं आता है साला हमेशा. I used to, I mean, I'm sure you've experienced it too, Vidya. Like I've said this in so many times. Like my mother, instead of saying, you know, ये तुम्हारी वो लाल वाली ड्रेस का है, she would say, ये ना चांदी पे तूने गाढ़ा कपड़ा काटे, she would say, वो 500 रुपए वाली ड्रेस काटे हुए तुंजी. And I used to think this community reduces everything to money, and which was also part of the shame. But when I look at what the Sindhi Hindus had managed to do back in Hyderabad and Karachi and so on, It is nothing short of a tragedy that this is the nature, this is the level to which things changed. That the imperatives to make two ends meet does this to human beings. I think it's very tragic. I don't judge anymore. It just saddens me. I can't judge, obviously. I was very judgy as a younger person.
Thank you, ma'am.
So, time for the next question.
Anuparna,
Sure, Antara, yes.
yeah, I had a few actually.
Mhm.
Thank you, Rita, for that very fascinating and insightful talk. So, just a few things on which I would invite further thoughts and comments from you. So, one, all of them are kind of connected to some of the discussions that we have been having in response to the other questions. So, one point that was raised by Bhavna was about the role of the government. So, taking that further, I was curious to know about, and you also mentioned, and we all know about this, like Sindhi colleges and educational institutes. And so, what kind of role did they have? Endeavors from the community, educational institutions and so on, in sustaining the cultural identity or the language of the community. So that was one, and I had two more, but should I?
No, I'll respond to this one first.
Okay.
So I think we need to see that, first of all, the Sindhis themselves played an enormous role. Without help from the state, the Sindhi trusts and Sindhi businessmen established series of colleges and institutions. You only have to read the work of someone like Nandita Bhavnani when she talks about what they managed to do in Bombay. Educational institutions, cultural institutions. If you read someone like, that book Cosmopolitan Connections, Anthony Falzon, and he talks about how in Bombay, the Sindhis managed to recreate many organizations that they were associated with. As for the state, I think Bhavna was also asking this question, and I didn't respond to her, so I think I'll repeat that. One is that the Sindhis weren't expected in India, right? There was a sense that there was no violence in Sindh. There's no reason why people should be coming here. So it didn't seem like justified to do that. And therefore, the kind of infrastructure that was being put in place for Punjab, for instance, was not being put in place for Sindh at all. So the Sindhi migrants were a bit of an afterthought. They were a bit of a nuisance. And the state managed to somehow do some jugaad and asked these four states, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, to put together some kind of rehabilitation refugee processes. But if you're looking at the correspondence between, for instance, Gandhi or even Sardar Patel with representatives from Sindh, you see a huge degree of betrayal in the Congress. You see a huge degree of betrayal that people like Chowthram Gidwani, Jairam Das Daulatram, all of them are conveying, saying that you guys are not even looking at us. And in fact, we are being told, why are you doing this? But you don't understand that we don't feel this is our country anymore. We are feeling scared. We feel things are changing so fast. And so there was this, that the kind of help then which was put together, and I don't want to completely underestimate it either, because that's not a very informed and a nuanced position to take, was of many kind, that the Sindhis were given refugee camps. As is often the case with refugee camps, they are usually on the outskirts of the city, right? Because you don't want angry immigrants to be coming into the city, and it can be pretty sensitive. And so you would be given refugee camps which are sort of far from the city. These were usually World War II army barracks, right? Which were then given to the Sindhis. For instance, in Kolhapur, this is where the Jews had lived before the Sindhis. So when that happens, they are being given food, but there is a huge problem about unemployment. But sometimes there are also private people who stepped forth, mill owners, for instance, in certain regions, certainly in Gujarat, they stepped up and they said, we will give to the Sindhi community cut pieces, which is that pieces which are left, which are not being used out of the huge kind of a yarn of cloth. And you will find, in fact, very often the Sindhis in what is called the cut piece business, that they will have small pieces, they will start selling blouse pieces and so forth. So there were ways by which the state was doing what it could. But as far as language is concerned, Sindhi becomes a part of the 8th schedule in 1968. Up until then, it is not a scheduled language at all. Now, what does that actually do to the community? Really speaking, very little. It can establish schools for you. It can give you textbooks. It can give you awards. Can it ensure that people live with this language? Who's to ensure that? And I think this is where I want to kind of make a very, I'm guessing that Anuparna and you, Antara, you would be familiar, right, with the Silletis or the Marwadis, for instance, in Kolkata. And you know that when you are part of a certain hegemonic culture, the hegemonic culture is not going to give you a mirror into what your reality is. As a Sindhi, for me in Gujarat, it's not as if there were other people who were speaking back to me in Sindhi. I was speaking Sindhi at home, and from a language, it almost became a dialect because it was restricted only to conversation at home. It's not as if I was going out into a world where anybody needed to know or hear or recognize or understand this language. How is a market and a state to make a language thrive unless that language has been given a purpose to thrive? What is the mirroring for that language, right? And I wrote somewhere recently, this is a book that Sahas Agrawal is doing called Sindhi Reflections. And I just finished a chapter which I call A Beautiful Broken Bowl. And basically, I talk about how languages, when they don't find respect, like people, they also shrink in corners. Right? They also, they know they are not welcome here. And something like that happens to the Sindhi language. So I think it is the issue about the language is very complex. The community collaborated upon the idea of forgetting the language, on its amnesia. And I think there, maybe we have ourselves to blame. And very often, in that book, Sindhi Reflections, I've written this in great detail. Someone is saying that, but I wasn't spoken to in Sindhi. We very often, we emphasize speaking in, but we don't actually think of being spoken to. What happens if you are not spoken to, right? Which means that the constitutive role of language is not happening, right? Language is what comes to you through overhearing, eavesdropping, gossip, rumor, being spoken to, being scolded in, being complimented in. It is not only names of items. So is the state responsible? I think the question of pinning down blame or responsibility is not of interest to me. What is of interest to me is what is the residue that we are left with?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Rita. So another question I had was about this this whole negotiation between shame and pride that you have also underlined. And you mentioned amnesia just now, and of course that they were complicit, the community was complicit in the forgetting. And of course, Anuparna also mentioned silence. So I'm just wondering, you also mentioned new narratives now on Twitter and other, perhaps digital, through digital modes. So I'm just kind of trying to think through this. So this negotiation or this transition from shame to pride? Is it also a kind of generational thing that from the amnesia of the partition which was there initially, and the reticence and the silence, has there been a kind of post-memorial generation now? You identified yourself as a second generation person who's recuperating these stories. So is there a kind of post-memorial recuperation which is happening now, in which we are seeing this kind of movement towards pride from an earlier shame? Or is that maybe too straightforward?
Let me just say, Antara, it's a glimmer. It's not something that I want to put my money on.
Mm-hmm.
It is, I see a certain shift, but I need to see something more than this. Yeah.
Okay.
But I was just curious there. Yeah, Nanda, please.
Yes. I just thank Rita. So I'll let you continue.
Actually, it's an extension of your question. There's this curious shift, but this dialectic between shame and pride, because sometimes it's also the shame from the pride. Because some of the text, I felt that, this shame primarily comes from a sense of, again, that self-respect or pride of a very active, entrepreneurial community who as you kind of pointed out, and that was there in many of the writings that you sort of, pointed, that not somebody who are not used to taking a lot of, succor or dole from the government, and the treatment, because when they landed up in India, the Sindhi community, again, because, they were relatively well off and they were looking for a better deal. Government has been at times very impatient with them, and because they were looking for urban spaces, or better opportunities, and government said that if whatever we can give you, you have to take it to an extent. Even that kind of came as a feedback that we need to rebuild our lives and not depend on the government. If we want better, we must do it ourselves, because that's there in the stories as well that you have translated, that if we want better, we must, instead of mourning, instead of kind of sitting back, let's kind of stand up and rebuild the community. So that dialectic. So if you want to kind of talk a little more about the shame and the pride, because we have a few, and the reticence, of course, because that's something there.
Yeah, I think one is that the idea of a Sindhi partition subject was to say that I need to immediately make sure that I have a business to run, right? And therefore, in order to become this model immigrant, when do you become a model immigrant? When there is that much forgetfulness about who you were, right? In that process, the community managed to rise almost like phoenix out of ashes and created a new life and so forth. Now, the shame that I was speaking about was actually, in some sense, it was my generation, not the one that migrated, right? And now when I'm looking at my daughter's generation, I see that there is a sense in some of the younger people about, oh, there's something cool going on here. This is a community that has a lot of Sufi music. There are Sufi traditions. There's Shah Abdul Latif, Abida Parveen, Damadam Mast Kalandar, Ajrak Pen Rahe, kuch syncretic hai, kuch interesting hai. Pakistan also has this, Coke Studio has so many Sindhi songs, right? So Umar Marvi and what have you. So there is a sense that there is something interesting going on here. And how come we haven't thought about it? So among the more kind of a liberal, if you like, the more hatke, if you like, 20-something younger generation, there is more interest now, right? And the shame was my generation, because we were facing a lot of stereotypes in schools and colleges, but I'm sure Vidya will also agree with it. I mean, she's much younger, but it was certainly there. What has also happened now is that there is a certain pan-global celebration, right, of many communities. I mean, that's the nature of the transatlantic sort of transnational solidarity also which happens. So I think we need to see not one replacing the other, but as Antara was asking, maybe we need to see that as an intergenerational shift. But we also don't need to see that shift as complete. We need to see that there is something going on here. Uh, yeah. Is there anything more you wanted to know?
We're good, I think. Antara?
No, I'm also good. Yeah.
So for the we can have the next question.
Where is the chat? I'm not able to see the questions.
No, they're not typing, so they are sort of articulating their questions.
Okay.
So I have a small question in between. So while people are sort of thinking about the questions, so you have very interestingly, very provocatively pointed out these three things: spirituality, business, and cinema. So what's this connection between cinema? If you could tell us a little more.
Yeah, actually, people don't talk about this. I think I'm the more I'm observing, the more I'm convinced that it has something. And then recently, I came across an article by, what's Sajni Kriplani at Jadavpur University.
Sajni.
So I think Sajni had a piece in this book that I'm mentioning where she says that the Sindhi community took to Hindi films like as their only form of culture accessible to them. And I thought, okay, that explains why I do what I do. Because I grew up with the only sense of so-called quote unquote culture was my parents would say, oh, when you were born, we were watching this film. And that's why we named you this way. Or we watched one show after another. And everybody was talking like that. And I just thought my family is like that because they don't know anything better. They are like such illiterate people. All they do is to watch films. Now I realize that I think the question that Vidya was asking, what happened to the cultural traditions? I think this is the only one that replaced it. But what is also very interesting, Anuparna, is if you read, for instance, I write this column called Picture with Rita. And the very first column that I wrote there was how when I was interviewing one of my chachas about what did he do when he left Karachi on 6 January 1948, which is when Karachi witnessed its first riots. And he says, छा कबो एडा माण्हू आया खबर ही न पे पे डप्पी पे लगे डर लग रहा था. So I said, so Dada, what did you do? He said, picture ॾिसण हली हुयमि. I went to watch a film. And he watches the film, which he told me was Mahal, but actually it was Jugnu. And it took me so many years to actually figure out that no, he made a mistake. It was this other film he would have watched because he remembered it by a song. And I wrote my first piece in that column about this. And the point I make there, and I'm just reiterating it, which is basically to say that not the history, but the memory was important. And the memory was this, that even on the day when your life is in danger, this is a community that goes and watches a film. That there is something very, very interesting and pragmatic about my community. And it does not wear its sentimentalism very well. And which is one of the reasons why it also does not spend too much time thinking about partition.
It's fascinating, actually. So do we have any other question from the house? Maybe then I just take, if we don't have one, then I have one last question before. I know, Rita, we are making you speak for it's nearly 1 hour, 30 minutes nearly. But I have, okay, Vidya has something to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Ma'am, since you talked about probably even in the most serious events of your life, looking for something that kind of gives you an escape, if that be the case. Again, I'm coming back to my first question, so the Sufi culture, I mean, in the midst of riots and Hindu-Muslim rift and the partition and all of that, do you think, which I've read in your books also, especially The Burden of Refuge, and later on you wrote articles on it with Priya Kumari as well, where you've talked about the syncretism. Do you think that that kind of more than forgetting the culture, do you think that gives you a very strong sense of undivided self because you have these Sufi connections?
That's such yeah,
Thank
it's a
you.
lovely question. It's a
Thank
very
you.
lovely question, Vidya, and it certainly merits
Thank you.
thinking about. And I think I don't want to be specific and say it's Sufi, but certainly there is a spiritual fortitude, and that fortitude may come from Guru Nanak, it may come from Sufi thought, it may it may come from being a trader, business community, that pragmatism. But I think it is certainly there, and it was evident even at the time of partition. Uh, भई ठीकु आहे हल हाणे हिते जेको थियो गुरु जिते विहारे उते कंदासीं and I have seen that how, for instance, my sister became a widow in her 40s. The moment the cremation happened, she had already cleaned up the entire house on the same day. And my father passed away. The next day, his cupboard was clean. My mother had cleaned up everything. And this idea that you can't live with the lingering effects of anything, that you got to move on, that history may not take you anywhere. And acha, ये वही थोड़ी है वो, right? This idea कि ऐसे बैठ थोड़ी जाएगा, है ना? ये वही थोड़ी है वो. Halandwal. I mean, one of the I actually began का गुजरी सा बाबा, मतलब जो गुजर गई है वो अच्छी ही गुजरी है, अब उसके बारे में सोचना नहीं है. And this Gujri Zabhava is to actually, it is a certain relationship with the past, which is to say that the past is not available to us to now for us to scrutinize, spend time over it, think about it, mourn over it. And therefore, this idea that we've got to put that behind. And really speaking, what our strengths are, Vidya, those are also the sources of our weakness. And what strengthen the community. But this is also made us asunder from a certain past. And I think I live with both. I don't want to become one or the other. You understand? And that's what I think I do want to say, that for me, the idea is not to reclaim, but the idea is also not to reject. But the idea is for me to kind of be its subject, but also be a spectator, to be its witness, but also be a part of it. Because identities can be prison houses, but identities are also homes. And when do homes become prison houses for us? I think once again, the pandemic gives us a great lesson there, right? That home what provided us with a haven and gave us safety and protected us. But we also know that how prison-like homes have begun to feel now. So I think I want to be that ambivalent.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
So, thank you, Vidya. So we have, instead of my question, I think we have the question from, Ishaq. So Ishaq, why don't you sort of just kind of unmute yourself and ask question directly? Ishaq, are you there? Yeah, go ahead. We can see you. Yeah.
I can't
Ishaq,
hear.
you're not audible. You're visible, but not audible. Rita, Ishaq's question is there in the chat box, though.
But I'm not able to. How do I see the chat box?
Okay. I sort of, should I read it for you?
Yeah,
then,
please.
Ishaq? Yeah. Ma'am, I wouldn't know so much about the Sindhi community. Thank you so much. My friend, who is a Kothari, never ever talked about this, save the sense of homogeneous identity of of his that I saw through his excellent camaraderie with more typical Bania kids, who were mostly Agarwals in West Bengal. That's interesting. So, so the amnesia that you talked about, does it also happen to come with the other communities that was similar to, say, the mainstream Muslim identity? And sincere apologies if any terms sound pejorative. Yeah.
So
Should I
Ishaq,
repeat the last?
no,
Yeah.
no, no. I understood what exactly the Kotharis are not Sindhis, Ishaq. So the camaraderie that you saw between Agrawals and Kotharis is basically camaraderies of people from Rajasthan. These are Baniyas from Rajasthan. Some are Jain Baniyas and some are non-Jain Baniyas or Vaishnav Baniyas, but they are not Sindhis. I am a Makhija. Kothari is my husband's surname. I was desperate to have another surname for reasons that I already explained to you. Yeah? Okay.
So we had quite a few questions and we had a very, very productive session. So I think instead of tiring you out, I think we should now wind up. But just to kind of point out, I learned a few days back that we actually talking about the educational institution. We have a Sindhi college here, and that too for girls. But as expected, they're mainly sort of MBA and, commerce subjects. They don't have too many humanities subjects there. But yes, we have a Sindhi college in the city itself. And now I just kind of pass it on to Antara to say the last few words.
And I finally managed to open chat. I'm so used to Zoom that I hadn't seen it at all. So while you guys go ahead, I'm just quickly going to see if there is something that I should have seen.
Yeah, sure. So I think we will wrap it up now, and I'd like to thank Rita for that very interesting talk and discussion afterwards. And again, I also learned a lot, and I'm curious to know more, and I'm looking forward to reading some work by Rita, which I haven't yet looked at. So thank you so much, Rita, and I'd like to thank the audience also for that wonderful, invigorating participation. And I think we've had a really lively discussion at the end, and there was a lot to think about, and there's a lot for us to take away from that talk and to deliberate on further. So I think let us end here by thanking Rita and everybody else for their active participation.
And we'll take this further. We'll have another, series of, and maybe next time it should be a live lecture. So yes, we're going to have it again. And the other thing is, of course, a big thanks to the ISA students as well, because despite their exams, so they're actually, preparing, writing their term papers for the exams. So, but nonetheless, they have made it a point to kind of come and attend. I could see a lot of them. So thanks to them as well. Yeah, thank you. Thanks to all. And yep. So bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and I think Deepika Kevlani had a question, but maybe Anuparna, you can give her my email address or something or whatever.
Sure. We can do that.
Yeah. All right.
Deepika, write to me. I'll share it with you. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye. Okay, close the